I never thought a compost bin could cause such chaos. Honestly, it all started with good intentions. I wasn't trying to make a statement or pick a fight with anyone. I just wanted to do my part. A small, simple thing to help the environment. It hit me one Saturday morning while I was drinking coffee and scrolling through articles about sustainable living. There were all these tips about reducing waste, and one headline jumped out at me. Composting. The easiest way to make a big difference. I thought, why not? I already recycled. I used reusable bags. Composting felt like the natural next step. Our neighborhood was your typical suburban setup. Rows of manicured lawns, cookie-cutter houses, and neighbors who cared way too much about what everyone else was doing. We had an HOA, of course, and not just any HOA. This one was practically a dictatorship in khakis and polos. They had rules for everything: how tall your grass could be, what color mulch you were allowed to use, even the shade of white your mailbox had to be painted. It was ridiculous. But up until that point, I'd kept my head down and followed the rules. I didn't want drama. So when I decided to start composting, I went out of my way to make sure I wasn't doing anything crazy. I bought a nice, discreet compost bin online, a dark green one that blended into the backyard pretty well. It wasn't some rotting pile of food scraps sitting out in the open. It had a lid, a locking mechanism, vents. The whole thing was tidy and odor-free. I even put it behind a row of shrubs so it wouldn't be an eyesore from the street or the neighbor's yard. Honestly, you'd have to be looking for it to even notice it was there. At first, I was actually excited. I started collecting food scraps, coffee grounds, vegetable peels, eggshells, and tossing them into the bin. I even got my kids involved. We made a game out of it. Who could collect the most compost points each week? It felt good, like we were doing something meaningful, even if it was on a small scale. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. Nobody said a word. But then, one afternoon while I was outside flipping the compost to aerate it, I heard a voice from over the fence. It was Mrs. Pennington, the queen bee of the HOA board. She was standing there with her little designer, sunglasses perched on her head, holding a glass of white wine like she was at a gala instead of in her backyard. And she was staring at my compost bin like it was a pile of nuclear waste. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, is that what I think it is?" I laughed a little awkwardly and said, "Yeah, it's a compost bin. I'm trying to reduce our household waste." She took a long sip of her wine, looked me up and down, and said, loud enough for anyone within 50 feet to hear, "How progressive of you." The way she said it, it wasn't a compliment. The next day, I started noticing more glances. People walking their dogs would slow down in front of my house. Neighbors I used to chat with would suddenly find excuses to cross the street instead of passing by. One guy, a board member of course, even made a big show of covering his nose as he walked past. It was ridiculous. The compost bin didn't smell. It wasn't leaking. It wasn't even visible unless you were nosy enough to peek behind my bushes. But the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. A few days later, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my doormat. It was from the HOA. The letter had that same passive-aggressive tone they always used, the kind where they pretended to be concerned neighbors while actually just bossing you around. It said they had received several complaints about an unsightly structure in my yard, and that I needed to address the issue immediately to maintain neighborhood standards. I stood there on my porch, reading the letter over and over, getting angrier by the second. Unsightly structure? It wasn't a broken-down car on blocks. It wasn't a giant inflatable Santa Claus left up in July. It was a neat little compost bin, tucked behind bushes, helping the earth. At first, I thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe if I explained, they'd back off. So I went to the next HOA meeting. Bad idea. When I brought up the compost bin, the room practically vibrated with fake politeness. Mrs. Pennington gave me a tight smile and said, "While we appreciate your enthusiasm for green living, the aesthetics of our neighborhood are very important. We want to maintain property values." A few people actually chuckled over a compost bin. I tried to reason with them. I explained how it was fully enclosed, odorless, and hidden from view. I even offered to move it further back into my yard if that would help. But it didn't matter. Their minds were already made up. Mrs. Pennington gave me a condescending little nod and said, "We'll take it under advisement," which was HOA speak for no way in hell. I left the meeting frustrated but determined. I wasn't doing anything wrong. The HOA bylaws didn't even mention compost bins. I'd checked. I figured if they wanted to turn this into a fight, fine. I could be stubborn too. And as it turned out, they had no idea just how badly their little mockery was about to backfire. I wish I could say that after the HOA meeting, things cooled down, that people moved on and forgot about the compost bin tucked away behind my bushes, but nope. If anything, they doubled down. The very next morning after the meeting, I caught one of my neighbors, Doug, who loved to brag about his perfect lawn like it was a golf course, standing on the sidewalk with his phone out. He wasn't even subtle about it. He was straight up taking pictures of my backyard like he was on some secret spy mission. I walked outside, coffee mug in hand, and stared at him. He froze for a second, then gave me this fake, sheepish smile and said, "Just, checking on some landscaping ideas." Yeah, right. By the end of the week, it was obvious that my compost bin had become the latest neighborhood scandal. People whispered about it at the mailbox. I caught dirty looks at the grocery store. Even the neighborhood Facebook page, normally filled with lost dog posts and bake sale announcements, had thinly veiled concerns about residents, bringing down the property values with questionable yard choices. One night, I scrolled through the page and found a post from none other than Mrs. Pennington herself. No names, of course. She was too careful for that. But the wording was unmistakable. While we all value environmental stewardship, we must remember that the appearance of our homes affects everyone's investment. Let's keep our yards clean, beautiful, and free of unnecessary clutter. The comments were even worse. People chimed in with passive-aggressive gems like, maybe some people need a reminder about community standards. First, it's a compost bin. Next, it's chickens and goats. If you want a farm, move to the countryside. It was pathetic. And then came the flyers. One afternoon, I found a bright orange paper taped to my front door. Big, bold letters. Across the top, HOA Beautification Campaign, keeping our community pristine. Underneath, it listed a bunch of things the HOA deemed eyesores that residents were encouraged to report immediately. Right there, number 3 on the list. Composting structures or similar unsightly yard additions. They weren't even pretending anymore. This was a full-on campaign against my tiny, tucked-away, environmentally friendly bin. At first, I laughed. It was so petty, it was almost funny. But after a few days of getting side-eyed by basically everyone I used to be on friendly terms with, I started getting angry. Really angry. I mean, seriously. What was wrong with these people? I wasn't hurting anyone. I wasn't violating any bylaws. I was literally doing something good for the planet, and they were acting like I was stockpiling toxic waste in my backyard. It got worse at the next HOA meeting. I wasn't even planning on going. I figured I needed a break from their nonsense. But one of my friends from the other side of the neighborhood texted me and said, "You might want to show up. They're planning something." So I did. Sure enough, midway through the meeting, Mrs. Pennington cleared her throat and announced they were proposing a new amendment to the HOA rules. I'll give you 3 guesses what it was about. That's right, a ban on compost bins, piles, or similar refuse containers in all yards, front or back. I sat there, staring at her, while she prattled on about community cohesion and visual harmony. The other board members nodded like bobbleheads. It was obvious this whole thing was personal. But here's the thing about HOA rules. You can't just snap your fingers and make them law. To pass a new amendment, they needed a 2/3 majority vote from the entire neighborhood, which meant, technically, they had to convince a lot more people than just the busybodies on the board. I realized right then that I had a choice. I could quietly remove my compost bin, bow my head, and let them win. Or I could dig in and, oh man, I was done playing nice. When Mrs. Pennington smugly asked if there were any questions about the proposed amendment, I stood up. "Yeah, I've got one," I said, nice and loud. "You keep talking about keeping the neighborhood pristine. What about the fact that we throw away thousands of pounds of food waste every year?" Shouldn't we be encouraging residents to be environmentally responsible? A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to anyone pushing back. Mrs. Pennington smiled, that tight, fake smile she always used, and said, "We understand your passion, but we also have to consider what's best for everyone." I didn't back down. If you cared about what was best for everyone, you'd be encouraging sustainability, not mocking it. That got a few murmurs. After the meeting, as people filtered out, a few neighbors actually came up to me and whispered things like, "I think what you're doing is great, but, I don't want to get involved." Cowards. But still, it told me something. Not everyone was against me. Some people just didn't have the guts to stand up to the HOA, fine by me. If the board wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I started printing out articles about the benefits of composting. Less landfill waste, reduced greenhouse gases, richer soil. I left copies at the community center bulletin board. I posted links on the neighborhood Facebook page. I even made a little sign for my compost bin that said, "Turning trash into treasure, composting for a greener tomorrow." It was corny, sure, but it made my point. And slowly, a few neighbors started to come around. One woman from 2 streets over, someone I barely knew, messaged me asking for advice on starting her own compost pile. Another guy down the block set up a small herb garden and mentioned he wished he had compost to feed it. It was a tiny shift, but it was happening. Meanwhile, the HOA kept pushing. They sent out reminder emails about the upcoming vote. They handed out more flyers. They even scheduled a community beautification day, clearly hoping to rally people against me and my ugly bin. It felt like I was David facing off against Goliath. But I wasn't backing down. Not when I knew I was right. Little did they know, the compost bin they mocked was about to become the very thing they'd end up bragging about. They just didn't see it coming yet. After the HOA meeting, it was like they declared an unofficial war against my compost bin. I could feel it every time I stepped outside. Neighbors I used to wave to would quickly look the other way. People would cross the street rather than pass by my house. Even kids on bikes seemed to swerve extra wide around my yard, like I had some contagious disease. It was insane. The board wasn't satisfied with passive-aggressive flyers and pointed Facebook posts anymore. Now, they were moving into full-blown harassment territory. It started small. A couple of friendly reminders showed up taped to my front door, printed on HOA letterhead, of course. Each one said the same thing in slightly different words. Please address the unauthorized structure in your yard to comply with community standards. Structure. You'd think I had built a junkyard roller coaster in my backyard, not set up a neat, professionally made compost bin. At first, I ignored them. There was no bylaw banning compost bins. I wasn't doing anything wrong, and they knew it. That's why they were pushing the new amendment so hard, because without it, they didn't have any real power. But then, things escalated. About 2 weeks before the big vote, I got a certified letter in the mail from the HOA's attorney. Yeah, they lawyered up. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were threatening to fine me. Not just once. They wanted to impose a daily fine until I removed the unauthorized refuse receptacle from the premises. A daily fine. For composting banana peels and coffee grounds. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the letter, my blood absolutely boiling. This is what they spend our dues on, I thought. Lawyers and intimidation tactics. The old me, the version of myself from a few months ago, might have caved. Might have hauled the compost bin off to the dump just to avoid the hassle, but not this time. No. If they wanted a battle, they were about to get a war. I called the attorney's office listed on the letter and calmly, very calmly, explained that there was no HOA bylaw prohibiting compost bins at the time I installed mine. I also pointed out that trying to impose retroactive rules without proper procedure wasn't just unethical. It could be considered harassment. The lawyer, to his credit, sounded exhausted. Like he knew this was petty nonsense but was getting paid to go along with it. He mumbled something about just following instructions and said he would pass along my response to the board. I hung up and immediately called a friend of mine, a real estate agent who specialized in HOA communities. She confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA couldn't enforce a rule that didn't exist when I started composting. They could try to pass the new amendment, sure. But until then, they had no real legal footing. Armed with that knowledge, I doubled down. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every note, every awkward interaction with a neighbor who tried to guilt-trip me. I even started taking daily photos of my backyard, including the compost bin, just to prove there was no smell, no pests, no mess. Meanwhile, the HOA ramped up their efforts. I came home one afternoon to find a board member, this guy named Bill, who treated the HOA rules like they were the 10 Commandments, standing in my backyard. Not the sidewalk, not the driveway, in my backyard. He was snapping pictures of the compost bin like he was building an FBI case file. I stormed outside and said, "Can I help you?" He jumped a little, clearly not expecting to be caught, but tried to play it cool. "Just inspecting a reported violation," he said, waving his phone around like it was some kind of badge, on private property without permission. I said, crossing my arms, "That's trespassing, Bill. Hope you're ready to explain that one in court." He turned beet red and mumbled something about concerned citizens before scurrying off. I reported the incident to the HOA's main office the next day, formally, in writing, certified mail. If they were going to play hardball, so was I. The funniest part? Through all this chaos, the compost bin kept doing its thing. I had rich, dark compost starting to form. My garden beds looked better than ever. My kids loved checking on the dirt factory, as they called it. It was a tiny little rebellion happening quietly in the background while the HOA lost their minds. But the real turning point came at a neighborhood event they called Community Appreciation Day. It was supposed to be a big gathering. Food, trucks, music, games for the kids. A way to bring everyone together, according to the flyers they stuck on everyone's doors. Of course, Mrs. Pennington and the board organized it. Of course, it was all about appearances, and because Karma has a wicked sense of humor, something incredible happened. The landscaping company that maintained the common areas showed up that morning with giant bags of mulch and, wait for it, compost, literal compost, to use in the flower beds and decorative planters around the park. I almost died laughing when I overheard Mrs. Pennington, yes, the same woman who tried to exile me over my compost bin, gushing to a vendor about how important sustainable practices were to the neighborhood's image. I stood there, holding a lemonade, just staring at her, wondering if she even heard herself. That was the moment I realized something. They didn't care about composting. They didn't care about the environment. They cared about control, about appearances, about being able to dictate every little thing their neighbors did, even if it made no sense. The hypocrisy was enough to make me sick, but it also gave me an idea. If they wanted compost for their events, compost that made them look good, in front of vendors and local officials, maybe I should give them exactly what they wanted. On my terms. They tried to force me to get rid of it. But pretty soon, they were going to be begging to use it. And when they did? Oh, I wasn't about to let them forget how hard they fought against it in the first place. I didn't think it was possible, but after Community Appreciation Day, things got even weirder. Way weirder. It all started with a knock at my door one afternoon. I was in the middle of turning the compost, doing the thing they all hated, when I heard it. I wiped my hands off on a towel, grumbling under my breath, and opened the door fully prepared for another passive-aggressive flyer or a polite reminder taped to the frame. But it wasn't a flyer. It was Doug. Yeah, that Doug. The one who took pictures of my yard like he was working for the paparazzi. He stood there awkwardly, holding a baseball cap in his hands, looking about as uncomfortable as a man could possibly look. Hey, he said, clearing his throat. I was wondering if you might have some extra compost. I blinked. At first, I thought maybe I'd misheard him. Surely the same guy who complained about my ugly dirt bin wasn't asking me for compost. But no. He just stood there, shuffling from foot to foot, waiting for an answer. I crossed my arms. Compost? You mean from my ugly compost bin? Doug winced like I'd slapped him. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just that, well, the new plants the HOA put in at the park aren't doing so hot. They thought maybe a little compost would help, and someone mentioned you. Might have some. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I wanted to say no. I really, really did. After everything they put me through, the notes, the fines, the public shaming, the idea of handing over a single spoonful of compost to them felt almost traitorous. But then I remembered my plan. If they wanted compost, fine. They were going to get it. And they were going to owe me. I smiled sweetly at Doug. Of course. I'd be happy to help. In fact, why don't I bring it over myself? He looked so relieved you'd think I had just offered him a winning lottery ticket. Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. I'll let Mrs. Pennington know. Oh, I thought, please do. That weekend, I packed up a few bags of my finest, richest compost. The stuff was black and crumbly and smelled like fresh earth. Absolutely perfect. And then, just for fun, I printed out a bunch of little labels that said, "Generously donated by my name, proud supporter of sustainable living." I stapled one onto every single bag. When I showed up at the park with my bags of compost, Mrs. Pennington's face was a picture. She looked like she'd bitten into a lemon, smiling through gritted teeth, pretending to be gracious while clearly wanting to scream. "Oh, how thoughtful of you," she said, reaching for one of the bags. I handed it over with an exaggerated smile. "No problem at all. Just doing my part for the environment and for the community." I made sure to say it loud enough for a few nearby neighbors to hear. The best part? They actually used it. They spread my compost in all the new flower beds, the landscaping around the playground, even the decorative planters at the clubhouse. And thanks to that rich organic matter, the plants thrived. Over the next few weeks, the park looked better than it had in years. Flowers exploded with color. Shrubs filled out thick and lush. Even the struggling little saplings they'd planted shot up a couple of feet practically overnight. People started noticing. They loved it. At the next HOA meeting, Mrs. Pennington stood up and proudly announced that the board's commitment to sustainability and beautification was paying off, and that, thanks to the generous contributions of environmentally minded residents, the neighborhood was looking better than ever. I almost fell out of my chair, laughing. Environmentally minded residents? Singular, Mrs. Pennington. Singular. After the meeting, more neighbors started approaching me. Real conversations this time, not the whispered, guilty kind. "How do you do it? What's your secret? Can you show me how to start? One of those compost thingies?" It was like flipping a switch. Suddenly, compost wasn't the enemy anymore. It was cool. It was trendy. The same people who had rolled their eyes and posted snarky comments were now asking me for advice on how to set up their own bins. Doug even invited me over for a beer one evening and showed off his brand new raised garden beds. He didn't come out and apologize for the way he acted at first, but honestly, watching him shovel compost into his flower beds was apology enough. The HOA board, meanwhile, tried to spin the whole thing as if they had championed the idea of sustainable landscaping all along. They even started tossing around the idea of hosting a Green Living Fair later that year, featuring a workshop on composting. Guess who they wanted to lead that workshop? Yup. Me. Mrs. Pennington herself cornered me after a meeting one night, fake smile firmly in place, and said, "We'd love for you to represent the neighborhood's commitment to sustainability at the fair. It would mean so much to everyone." I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the moment hang in the air. "Oh, I'd be honored," I said finally, making sure to put a little extra sugar in my voice. "But of course, I'll want to be clear that this all started with my personal compost bin, the one the board originally tried to ban." Her eye twitched just slightly. "Of course," she said through gritted teeth. Victory tasted sweeter than any composted tomato ever could. But honestly, it wasn't even about winning anymore. It was about the fact that I stood my ground, that I didn't cave to the pressure, the harassment, the dirty looks, and now, the very thing they mocked me for had become the thing they bragged about. The compost bin still sat in my backyard, right where it had always been. Except now, when people passed by, they didn't scoff or take pictures. They waved. They smiled. Some even stopped to ask questions. And every time I turned the pile, breathing in that rich, earthy smell, I couldn't help but grin. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just growing, quietly, until no one can deny it anymore. If you had told me a year ago that the HOA, my HOA, would be bragging about compost bins like they invented them, I would have laughed you right off my front porch. But here we were. Fast forward a few months after the Green Living Fair, and suddenly composting wasn't just tolerated around here. It was a full-blown movement. They even put out a glossy full-color newsletter, with pictures and everything, proudly announcing the launch of the Community Composting Initiative. Guess whose backyard was front and center on page 1? Yep, mine. Right there next to a paragraph that started, "Thanks to the tireless efforts of the HOA board and our commitment to green practices, composting has become a hallmark of our neighborhood's sustainability efforts." I almost choked on my coffee when I read it. Tireless efforts of the HOA board? The same board that sent me threatening letters and tried to fine me into oblivion? The same board that called my compost bin visually disruptive and tried to have it banned? It was the most shameless rewrite of history I had ever seen. And honestly, it was hilarious. They held workshops, handed out flyers, even hosted a compost starter kit giveaway for new residents. At one point, Mrs. Pennington personally led a walking tour of the neighborhood to show off all the eco-friendly initiatives and made a very grand, sweeping gesture toward my compost bin, as if she had lovingly installed it herself. I swear I saw a vein pop out in her forehead when she had to say my name during the tour. Of course, we owe a lot of our composting success to my name here, one of our very first sustainable pioneers. Pioneer, what a word. Like I had strapped on a coonskin cap and blazed a trail through the Wild West, instead of just tossing carrot peels into a bin. But you know what? I let them have their little moment. Because by then, I had already won. My yard was thriving. The garden beds practically exploded with flowers and vegetables. Neighbors who used to sneer at me now came by to trade tomato seedlings and swap recipes for zucchini bread. Kids would run past my house shouting, "It's the dirt guy," like I was some kind of local superhero. The HOA even stopped fighting me on other things. When I put in a rain barrel, approved without a peep. When I planted native wildflowers instead of a boring, regulation-approved lawn, no complaints. When I suggested starting a community garden on one of the empty HOA lots, Mrs. Pennington practically tripped over herself. To second the motion, it was like the composting battle had broken some kind of spell. Maybe it made them realize that not every little thing needed to be micromanaged. Maybe it showed them that good things could grow when you just let people be. Or maybe, and this is what I really believe, they just liked taking credit for a success story. Either way, I didn't care, because every time they bragged about our composting program, it just reminded me. All of this started with a single stubborn decision. One little compost bin. One refusal to back down when the rules didn't make sense. And it reminded me that sometimes, standing your ground, even when you're standing alone, can change everything. There was this one moment that really drove it home for me. It was a warm spring afternoon. I was out in the yard turning the pile, same as always, when Mrs. Pennington herself pulled up in her golf cart. Yes, she had a golf cart. Of course she did. She got out, smoothing down her perfectly ironed slacks, and walked over like she had a mission. "My name," she said, in that clipped, businesslike tone she reserved for very important conversations. "I just wanted to personally thank you for all you've done for the neighborhood." I blinked at her, not sure if I was hallucinating. She pressed on. "You really showed us what's possible when residents care about their community. You should be proud." For half a second, I considered bringing up the letters. The fines, the trespassing, all of it. But then I realized I didn't need to. She knew. They all knew. I didn't need to rub it in. I didn't need to gloat. The flourishing gardens, the new friendships, the thriving park, they were proof enough. So, I just smiled and said, "Thank you. I'm glad I could help." She nodded like she was checking something off a mental to-do list, and got back into her golf cart. As she drove away, I turned back to my compost bin, my beautiful, once maligned, now legendary compost bin, and felt a wave of satisfaction so deep it was almost dizzying. Sometimes the biggest wins don't come with fireworks or parades. Sometimes they come quietly, one banana peel at a time, until suddenly everyone is singing a different tune, and you realize you didn't just win the fight, you changed the game.